Climate change is really happening. It's an enormous problem and everyone should take action. We see its effects everywhere. Record hot summers, rising sea levels, floods, melting Arctic and Antarctic ice, droughts, extreme storms, hurricanes, and wildfires. People need to pay attention to the crisis and millions do. However, far fewer pay attention to the issue closely connected to climate change. That is militarism, the system of weapons and personnel trained to respond to threats with physical violence. Military systems in the United States and many other countries are connected with climate change in many ways. In fact, the US military is the single largest emitter of CO2 in the world, apart from nations, and the war is the most carbon-intensive activity. Why is this so? The development, construction, and maintenance of military weapons and personnel requires intensive use of fossil fuels and produce CO2 emissions and toxic waste. Violent conflicts result in deforestation and destruction of wildlife habitat, pollution, destruction of water sources, and even more CO2 emissions. Wars require oil, lots of it. Then, absurdly, many wars are fought for oil. Yet emissions from military activities are not even counted when nations register their progress, or lack of progress, on climate change. We do not know how great these emissions are, but scientists for Global Responsibility, United Kingdom, have stated that emissions from military activities are an estimated 6% of the global total. For comparison purposes, consider that Canada's greenhouse gas emissions in 2016 accounted for 1.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. China accounted for 25.8%, and the US 12.8%. The Institute of Policy Studies, a progressive think tank, calls for demilitarization and a culture of care. That means care for the earth and care for each other. The impact of war on people's environments is terrible. Just one military jet, a US B-52, flying for 1 hour consumes as much fuel as the average driver uses in 7 years. Worrying about the environment, many people feel guilty about driving, and maybe we should, but it's even more important to act against militarism and the vast effects of large institutions and corporations. According to War Resisters International, global military expenditures in 2017 were $1.7 trillion. Resources spent on weapons and war are not available for research on other societal and social issues, things such as alternative energy, conservation, education, public health, and other goods. Military expenditures cost us thousands of opportunities to work for human security and survival. A factor contributing to military developments is that climate change puts pressure on people living in threatened areas. Poor people and some racial and ethnic groups are most likely to be exposed to polluted air and water. A Stanford study in 2019 predicted that sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and South Central and Southeast Asia will be the worst affected regions. Agriculture in Central America and the Ganges Basin in India will also be badly affected. One of the effects of climate change, drought, destroys crops and results in cattle dying. Desperate people do whatever they can to migrate. Extreme drought has been a significant cause of violent conflict in Syria, Sudan, Yemen, and Nigeria. A common response to migration, seen in the United States and parts of Europe, is to keep migrants out. Authorities put up barbed wire or build a wall. That requires force along borders, military force. A militaristic response to climate change is more military. Stronger, better military. And that's exactly the wrong way to go. Climate change, especially because of migration, leads to increased military activities. Then those military activities make climate change worse. It's a vicious cycle. Military strategists and planners do acknowledge the reality of climate change, but they do not see the need to reduce their activities accordingly. Instead, they generally understand climate change as a threat to their facilities and installations. Instead of seeking to reduce the threats posed by climate change, they look for military response to them. Consequently, they seek protection for their operations, demanding increased financial and scientific resources. When military resources are deployed in violent conflict, the situation is terrible. War is a humanitarian and environmental catastrophe. It destroys people and land, medical and scientific resources, water, power, and sewage treatment facilities. It leaves behind toxins, landmines, diseases, and suffering people. That's conventional war, war without nuclear weapons. Nuclear war would be even worse. If as many as 100 of the world's 13,400 nuclear weapons were used, the resulting smoke and dust would block out the sun for as long as 10 years. Costs to the agricultural industry could result in as many as 2 billion deaths, according to Jan Heflin, who studied the matter for an international physicians group. Nuclear winter would make the Earth colder, but it's not the solution to climate change. To meet the challenges of climate change, we need to understand its causes. Crucially important among these causes is militarism. We cannot remove the threat of climate change with guns, explosives, and tanks. We need to discover and broadcast the connections between climate change and militarism. If you care about the environment, learn more about militarism, and think about developing resources and forces for peace, not violence.